Everyone knows the Titanic hit an iceberg, but that's not the whole story. A set of missing keys, 7 ignored warnings, and a mystery ship that simply watched from a distance sealed its fate. To uncover more stories that history forgot, subscribe now and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next journey. Today, I am going to tell you one of the most fascinating and mysterious stories in all of history. It is the story of the Titanic. You have probably heard the name Titanic before. Maybe you have seen the famous movie, or perhaps you have read about it in a book. But I promise you, after listening to this story today, you will feel like you are hearing it for the very first time. I am going to tell you everything in great detail, and I think some things might even surprise you. So please find a comfortable place, sit back, and relax. Let's dive into the incredible world of the Titanic. By the end of this story, you will not only learn all about this famous ship, but you will also improve your English skills along the way. The Titanic was not just a ship. For so many people, it was a dream. It was a beautiful symbol of luxury, of success, and of human achievement. Let's go back in time to the early 1900s. In those days, ships were the main way to travel across the vast oceans. At that time, two major shipping companies, the White Star Line and the Cunard Line, were in a big competition. They were both trying to build the best and most luxurious ships in the entire world. The Cunard Line had two very fast and famous ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. These ships were known for their incredible speed. But the White Star Line wanted to do something different. They did not just want to build a fast ship. They wanted to create something unforgettable. They wanted true luxury, amazing comfort, and incredible size. So the White Star Line decided to build 3 new ships. These ships would be the largest and most luxurious in the world. Their names were the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. Out of these 3 sister ships, the Titanic became the most famous, but sadly not for the reasons the company had hoped. The Titanic was built in a city called Belfast in Northern Ireland. A famous shipbuilding company called Harland and Wolff was given this important job. The construction of this massive ship started in March of 1909, and it took almost 3 full years to complete. Thousands of workers worked day and night, carefully building this giant ship piece by piece. It was 882 feet, or 269 meters long, and it was 175 feet, or 53 meters tall. Can you imagine that to help you understand the Titanic was almost the size of 3 football fields, placed end to end? It was truly enormous. Now let's talk about why the Titanic was called unsinkable. The ship was built with 16 special watertight compartments. These were like separate rooms in the bottom of the ship that could be sealed off. The engineers who designed it believed that even if 4 of these compartments filled with water, the ship would still be able to float. This technology was so new and so advanced at the time that people really thought it was impossible for the Titanic to sink. The vice president of the White Star Line, a man named Philip Franklin, was so confident. He stood in front of the public and said, "The Titanic is unsinkable." Everyone believed him. The newspapers wrote about it, and soon the whole world knew the Titanic as the ship that could never, ever sink. Now let's step inside the Titanic and see what made it so special, so luxurious. At that time, traveling on the Titanic was not just a journey. It was an experience. The inside of the ship was designed to look and feel like a 5-star hotel. In fact, many people said that the Titanic was even better than the best hotels in the world. The beautiful wood paneling on the walls was carved by hand and then polished until it shined like glass. The stained glass windows sparkled in the sunlight, creating colorful patterns on the floors. There were 2 grand staircases, and one of them, the first-class grand staircase, became truly iconic. It was decorated with beautiful iron railings, little details made of gold, and a magnificent glass dome high above it that let the daylight stream in. This staircase connected several decks and was a place where wealthy passengers would gather. They would walk down the stairs slowly to show off their expensive clothes and beautiful jewelry. But the Titanic had more than just beautiful rooms. It had facilities that were very rare for ships at that time. There was a heated swimming pool, a relaxing Turkish bath where passengers could rest, and even an electric bath, which was considered a very modern luxury. There was a gymnasium with all the latest exercise machines, a squash court for people who loved sports, and a quiet library where passengers could sit and read books. The ship also had 2 barber shops for grooming and haircuts. There were also wonderful restaurants, cozy cafes, and special smoking rooms where passengers could socialize and meet new people. One of the restaurants, called the à la carte restaurant, was so fancy that you had to pay extra just to eat there. The first-class cabins were like rooms in a palace. They were decorated with soft silk curtains, elegant furniture, and the finest, most comfortable bedding. Even the second-class cabins were better than the first-class cabins on many other ships. The third-class cabins were much simpler, of course, but they were still clean and more comfortable than those on most other ships of that time. The Titanic cost $7.5 million to build back in 1912. Today, that would be about $200 million. The tickets to travel on the ship were also very expensive. A first-class ticket cost around $400 to $350 back then. That's like paying $100,000 for a ticket today. Second-class tickets were about $60, which is around $100 to $500 today. And the third-class tickets cost between $15 and $40, which would be like $400 to $1,000 in today's money. The Titanic was truly a luxury ship, and only the very rich could afford to travel in first class. When the Titanic was finally completed, people all over the world were filled with excitement. It was the biggest, most beautiful ship ever built. Famous actors, successful businessmen, and wealthy families booked their tickets months in advance. Everyone wanted to be a part of the Titanic's maiden voyage, its very first journey across the ocean from Southampton, England to New York City in the USA. The Titanic set sail on April 10, 1912. Large crowds of people gathered at the port in Southampton just to see the ship off. You could feel the excitement in the air. Families waved goodbye to their loved ones, some with tears in their eyes. Photographers clicked pictures of the grand ship as it slowly and gracefully left the dock. On board, there were 224 passengers and crew members. Some of the wealthiest people in the world were there. This included John Jacob Astor IV, who was one of the richest men in America. There was Molly Brown, a famous and strong-willed socialite. And there was Isidor Straus, the co-owner of the famous Macy's department store, and his wife Ida Straus. There were also many immigrants traveling in third class. These people were hoping to start a new life in America. For them, the Titanic was more than a ship. It represented hope, a new beginning, and a brighter future. The Titanic's journey started very smoothly. The ship was cruising through the calm waters at a speed of 21.5 knots, which is about 40 kilometers per hour. Everything seemed perfect. Passengers enjoyed the luxurious facilities, they relaxed in their comfortable cabins, and they ate delicious food in the elegant restaurants. The weather was calm, and the sea looked peaceful and beautiful. But just 2 days into the voyage, the Titanic received its first ice warning. It was a message from another ship warning about large icebergs in the North Atlantic Ocean. At that time of year, in April, icebergs were common in that area. But nobody on board worried too much. After all, they were on the Titanic. The ship was unsinkable, right? The Titanic's journey continued, and by April 14, 1912, it had been sailing for 4 wonderful days. Everything still seemed perfect. Passengers were enjoying their luxurious surroundings. The sea was calm, and the sky was clear. But no one knew that this peaceful, beautiful day would soon turn into a disaster that the world would never, ever forget. Throughout the day, on April 14th, the Titanic received 7 separate iceberg warnings from other ships in the area. These important messages were sent through Morse code, which was a way of communicating using sounds of dots and dashes. Each warning informed the Titanic's crew about large icebergs that were floating ahead in the dark waters of the North Atlantic. But here is what happened with these warnings. Some of the messages never reached the Captain Edward John Smith because they were not marked as urgent. Some were sent to the Marconi wireless operators, who were very busy sending personal messages for the first-class passengers and didn't give the warnings enough attention. Even the warnings that did reach the captain were not taken as seriously as they should have been. Captain Smith believed his ship, the Titanic, was safe. The ship Titanic was advertised as unsinkable. And so many people, including its experienced captain, trusted this claim. Even though the warnings clearly suggested danger ahead, the captain did not slow down the ship. The Titanic continued to sail at its fast speed of 21.5 knots, about 40 kilometers per hour, through the dark, icy water. The night of April 14th was unusually dark. The moon was not visible in the sky, and the stars provided only a little light. This darkness made it very difficult to see anything far away in the distance. The sea was also unusually calm, which might sound like a good thing, but it wasn't. Normally, small waves would crash against the base of an iceberg, creating a line of white foam that would make it easier to spot. But on that night, the water was as smooth as glass, making the icebergs almost invisible. High above the ship's deck, 2 lookout men, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were stationed in the crow's nest. This was a small platform high up on the ship's mast. Their job was to watch carefully for any dangers ahead, especially icebergs. But they didn't have binoculars. The officer who had the key to the locker where the binoculars were kept had left the ship before the journey started, and forgot to hand the key over. This small mistake made their very important job even harder. At 11:39 p.m., everything changed forever. Frederick Fleet, sitting in the cold crow's nest, saw something dark and massive directly in front of the ship. At first, he wasn't sure what it was. It was just a shadow in the darkness. Then, as the Titanic moved closer, he realized what it was. It was an iceberg, a huge one. Fleet immediately rang the warning bell 3 times. This was the signal for danger ahead. He then grabbed the phone and called the bridge, the area where the officers controlled the ship. He shouted into the phone, his voice filled with panic. "Iceberg right ahead." The officers on the bridge, including First Officer William Murdoch, reacted very quickly. Murdoch gave orders to the crew to turn the ship hard to the left. He ordered them to reverse the engines to try and slow the ship down. But it was too late. Just 37 seconds after the iceberg was spotted at 11:40 p.m., the Titanic crashed into it. The iceberg was enormous. Researchers believe it was about 200 feet high and 400 feet long. They estimate that it was about 100,000 years old and weighed around 1.5 million tons. The collision was not a loud crashing sound. It was more of a long scraping noise. The impact caused large pieces of ice to break off and fall onto the deck of the Titanic. But the real damage, the deadly damage, was happening below the waterline, hidden from view. This brings us to one of the biggest mysteries of the Titanic. How could a piece of ice do so much damage to a ship made of solid steel? To understand this, let's look at a few important details. First, the iceberg's weight and strength. Icebergs are not soft, like the ice cubes in your drink. They are incredibly dense and solid with sharp, hard edges that can act like a knife. The part of the iceberg that you can see above the water is only a small fraction of its total size. Most of the iceberg was hidden underwater, making it extremely heavy and powerful. Second, the Titanic's steel. The Titanic was made of steel, of course, but the type of steel used in 1912 was not as strong as the steel we use in ships today. It had a weakness. It became very brittle in extremely cold temperatures, and the water in the North Atlantic that night was freezing. So when the iceberg hit the Titanic, the steel plates of the ship didn't bend. They cracked and broke. Third, the rivets. The metal rivets were like small bolts that held the Titanic's steel plates together. Another problem was that some of these rivets were made of a weaker material called wrought iron. When the powerful iceberg hit the ship, many of these rivets popped out, creating gaps in the ship's hull. As the iceberg scraped along the side of the Titanic, it opened up 6 narrow holes below the waterline. These holes were not huge, but they were long, and through them ice-cold seawater began pouring into the ship at an alarming rate. When the collision happened, most of the passengers didn't realize anything serious was wrong. Some people felt a slight jolt, a little vibration. Others heard a strange grinding noise as the iceberg scraped along the side of the ship. In the first-class dining room, a few people even joked about it. "What was that?" one might have asked. "Did we hit something?" In the engine room, however, the crew knew immediately that the situation was very serious. Water was rushing into the lower decks, filling the boiler rooms. The Titanic's famous watertight compartments were supposed to keep the ship safe, but the iceberg had damaged more compartments than the ship could handle. Scientists now believe that the iceberg that hit the Titanic started as part of a glacier in Greenland. Over thousands of years, it broke off and slowly drifted into the North Atlantic Ocean. By the time it met the Titanic, it was one of the largest icebergs in the area. Its enormous size and weight made it an unstoppable force of nature. By midnight, just 20 minutes after the collision, water had already flooded the first 5 compartments of the Titanic. This was a critical, terrible problem. The ship's design could handle flooding in 4 compartments, but not 5. Captain Smith was informed of the terrible damage, and in that moment he realized that his ship, the magnificent Titanic, was in serious trouble. The ship that was once called unsinkable was now sinking. But most passengers were still completely unaware of the danger. The beautiful music in the first-class lounge continued to play, and people were still talking and laughing, enjoying their evening. By 12:00 a.m. on April 15, 1912, just 20 minutes after the Titanic hit the iceberg, the situation became increasingly dire. Captain Edward John Smith, who had been so confident in his ship's safety just hours earlier, was now faced with the unimaginable truth the Titanic was going to sink. At midnight, Captain Smith called an emergency meeting with his senior officers. He gave them clear, urgent orders. He told them to start lowering the lifeboats to send distress signals to any nearby ships and to try and calm the passengers to avoid creating panic. The Titanic was equipped with 20 lifeboats. But these boats were not enough for the 224 people on board. The lifeboats only had space for about 1,978 people. This meant that more than 1,000 people would have no chance of survival if the ship sank. This was a terrible design flaw. The ship was actually built to carry more lifeboats, but the company decided not to include them. They wanted to keep the deck looking spacious and aesthetically pleasing. As the crew began preparing to lower the lifeboats, the Titanic's wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride started sending out distress signals using Morse code. They used the call sign CQD, which meant "come quick distress." A little later, they also started using SOS, which was the new international distress signal that was easier to recognize. One of these desperate distress signals was picked up by the RMS Carpathia, a passenger ship that was about 58 miles or 93 kilometers away. The captain of the Carpathia, Arthur Rostron, immediately ordered his crew to change course and head toward the Titanic at full speed. The Carpathia could travel at a maximum speed of 17 knots, but even at its fastest, it would take 4 long hours to reach the sinking ship. Meanwhile, other ships like the SS Alphas Assessor Californian were much closer. But tragically, they did not respond in time. The Californian's wireless operator had already gone to bed for the night and didn't hear the distress calls. As the crew started to lower the lifeboats, confusion and fear began to spread among the passengers. At first, most people didn't understand how serious the situation was. The Titanic was still brightly lit, the lights were on, and the ship's band had come out on deck to play cheerful music to try and keep everyone calm. In first class, some passengers even hesitated to leave their luxurious surroundings. They thought the lifeboats were just a precaution, a drill. They couldn't believe this grand ship was actually sinking. In third class, passengers faced a much harder and more confusing time. Many of them were trapped on the lower decks and struggled to find their way up to the lifeboats on the top deck. Language barriers made the situation even worse, as many third-class passengers were immigrants who didn't speak English. By 12:30 a.m., the first lifeboat was lowered into the freezing black water of the Atlantic Ocean. It had space for 65 people, but only 28 passengers were on board. This was a common and tragic pattern throughout the night. Many of the lifeboats left the Titanic half empty. This happened because passengers didn't believe the ship was truly sinking, or they thought they would be safer staying on the big, bright ship. As more and more water continued to pour into the Titanic, it became clear that the ship's watertight compartments were not enough to save it. These compartments were designed to keep water contained, but they only extended partway up the ship. Once the water filled a compartment and reached the top, it began spilling over into the next one, like water overflowing from an ice cube tray. By 1:30 a.m., the bow or the front of the Titanic was now fully underwater. The ship began to tilt forward at a noticeable angle, and real panic began to spread among the passengers who were still on board. As the lifeboats filled and were lowered into the water, the passengers faced another deadly threat, the icy water itself. The temperature of the North Atlantic that night was a shocking 2 degrees Celsius, or 28 degrees Fahrenheit. This water was so cold that it could cause deadly hypothermia within just a few minutes. Most of the passengers and crew who ended up in the water without a lifeboat did not survive for long. The Titanic had 224 people on board, but in the end, only 705 survived, most of them safe in the lifeboats. At around 2:15 a.m., the Titanic situation reached its breaking point literally. The immense weight of all the water flooding the front of the ship caused enormous pressure on the middle of the vessel. The bow was already deep underwater, pulling the rest of the ship downward. The stern, the back of the ship, was lifted high into the dark sky. The stress on the middle section of the ship became too much to handle, and with a terrible sound, the Titanic broke into 2 large pieces. The 2 halves of the ship sank separately. The bow section plunged down to the ocean floor. First, the stern floated in the air for a few moments, lights still flickering, before it also filled with water and sank into the depths. At 4:00 a.m., almost 2 hours after the Titanic disappeared beneath the waves, the RMS Carpathia finally arrived at the scene. The crew immediately began the difficult task of rescuing the survivors from the lifeboats. The crew of the Carpathia worked tirelessly, pulling people from the freezing cold. Many of the survivors were in shock, crying, or suffering from severe hypothermia. Some were so weak they could not climb aboard the ship and had to be lifted up with ropes. By 8:30 in the morning, all the survivors had been rescued, and the Carpathia set a new course for New York, leaving behind the wreckage of the Titanic and the bodies of more than 1,500 people who had perished in the disaster. After the Titanic tragedy, the world wanted answers. How could such a grand and unsinkable ship sink on its very first voyage? Why did so many lives have to be lost? As investigations began, one shocking controversy came to light. The mysterious role of another ship, the SS Californian, which was just 37 kilometers or 20 miles away from the Titanic when it sank. The SS Californian, a British steamship, was also sailing in the North Atlantic on the night of April 14, 1912, the same night the Titanic struck the iceberg. Unlike the Titanic, the Californian wasn't rushing to make headlines. It had actually stopped for the night because of the ice warnings. It was surrounded by icebergs, its engines were off, and it was stationary in the cold, quiet ocean. At around 11:10 p.m., the crew of the Californian spotted the lights of a large ship in the distance. This was the Titanic. From their deck, they could clearly see the lights of the enormous vessel. When the Titanic began to sink, its crew launched white rocket flares high into the night sky as a distress signal. These white flares were visible for miles and were meant to alert any nearby ships that something was terribly wrong. The crew of the Californian saw these flares. One of their officers, Second Officer Herbert Stone, reported to his captain Stanley Lord that he had seen the rockets. Stone also noted that the large ship appeared to be stopped in the water. However, Captain Lord dismissed the situation. He assumed it was nothing serious. He believed the ship might be having a party, or a celebration, which was not uncommon for ships with wealthy passengers. They're probably just having a party, he might have thought. One of the most critical mistakes made by the Californian was turning off its wireless radio for the night. The wireless operator Cyril Evans had gone to bed at 11:30 p.m., just a few minutes before the Titanic began sending its desperate distress signals. This decision proved to be catastrophic. If the Californian's radio had been on, its crew would have heard the Titanic's SOS calls and could have responded immediately. The ship was close enough to reach the Titanic in time to rescue hundreds of passengers who later died in the freezing water. The question remains, could the Californian have truly saved lives? The answer is almost certainly yes. The Californian was only 20 miles away, a distance it could have covered in about 2 hours. While it might not have arrived before the Titanic completely sank, it could have reached the site by 2:30 or 3:00 a.m. This was far earlier than the RMS Carpathia, which only arrived at 4:00 a.m. Even saving 100 or 200 more lives would have drastically reduced the scale of this terrible tragedy. The controversy surrounding the Californian led to significant and permanent changes in maritime safety practices. Ships were now required to keep their wireless radios manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to ensure that no distress signal would ever go unheard again. New guidelines were introduced for distress flares, making it perfectly clear that rockets in the night sky always meant danger, not celebrations. And ships were instructed that they had a responsibility to investigate any unusual activity, such as flares or nearby vessels that appeared to be stationary. Captain Stanley Lord's reputation was permanently damaged by the official inquiry. He spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name, but the controversy followed him until his death in 1962. The Titanic was not just a ship. It was a symbol of human ambition, of incredible luxury, and of beautiful dreams. But in one single tragic night, all of that was lost to the icy dark waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Even today, over a century later, the story of the Titanic remains one of the most fascinating and haunting stories in history. After the Titanic sank on April 15, 1912, it disappeared into the dark depths of the Atlantic Ocean. For decades, no one knew exactly where the ship rested. People could only imagine what it looked like lying on the silent seabed. Many believed the wreck would never be found, as it sank to a depth of 12,500 feet, or 3,800 meters, a place far beyond the reach of most explorers at the time. It wasn't until 1985, 73 years later, that the Titanic was finally discovered. Dr. Robert Ballard, a deep-sea explorer, and his dedicated team used advanced technology to find the shipwreck. They sent a robotic submarine to explore the ocean floor, and what they found was breathtaking. The bow, or the front of the ship, was sitting upright and was relatively intact, a ghostly shape in the darkness. The stern, the back of the ship, was twisted and broken, clear evidence of the ship splitting in two before it sank. Scattered all around the wreck, there were shoes, dishes, luggage, and other personal belongings of the passengers. It was a haunting and very sad reminder of the many lives that were lost that night. Since its discovery, scientists have studied the wreck and have found that it is slowly being destroyed. A type of bacteria, along with the salt water, is eating away at the metal. According to some experts, the Titanic could completely disintegrate and disappear by the year 2030, leaving nothing behind but our memories. Despite this, the fascination with the Titanic continues. It's not just about the ship itself, but about what it represents. It represents the ambition to build something extraordinary, but also the tragedy of overconfidence. It represents the human stories of survival, of loss, and of incredible courage. In 2012, to mark the 100th anniversary of the Titanic's sinking, an Australian billionaire named Clive Palmer announced an ambitious plan. He wanted to build a modern replica of the Titanic, which he would call Titanic 2. This new ship would have the same luxurious design as the original, including the grand staircases, the elegant dining rooms, and the vintage-style cabins. However, it would also include all the modern safety features, such as more than enough lifeboats for everyone and advanced navigation systems to ensure that history would not repeat itself. The ship was planned to sail on the exact same route as the original Titanic from Southampton to New York. While the project generated a lot of excitement around the world, it has faced many delays and challenges. To this day, Titanic 2 has not been completed. But the idea itself shows how deeply the Titanic's legacy continues to live on in people's hearts. 705 people survived the disaster, and most of them were women and children. Over 1,000 men perished, as many of them bravely gave up their spots on the lifeboats for others. The story of the Titanic taught the world many important lessons. One, overconfidence can be incredibly dangerous. People truly believed the Titanic was unsinkable. This feeling of overconfidence led to terrible mistakes, such as not having enough lifeboats and ignoring the ice warnings. 2. We must respect nature. The iceberg was a powerful reminder that nature is strong and unpredictable. Even the most advanced human creations can be humbled by the forces of the natural world. And 3rd, we must always plan for the worst. The Titanic disaster changed safety regulations for ships forever. Ships are now required to have enough lifeboats for every single person on board. Radios must be manned 24/7, and regular safety drills are mandatory. The Titanic story is a powerful mix of glamour, tragedy, and mystery. People are drawn to it because it feels like a cautionary tale, a story that warns us about human ambition and arrogance. The ship's wreck at the bottom of the ocean is like a time capsule, preserving a single tragic moment in history. But more than anything, it is the stories of the people on board, their bravery, their sacrifices, and their humanity that keep the Titanic alive in our hearts and minds. The story of the Titanic is not just about loss, it's also about learning and growing. So here is what we can take away from this incredible story. First, never give up. The survivors of the Titanic faced unimaginable trauma, but many of them went on to rebuild their lives. Their resilience is a true inspiration to all of us. 2. Always be prepared. Life is unpredictable. Whether it's a shipwreck or a personal challenge in your own life, being prepared can make all the difference. And 3. We must learn from mistakes. The Titanic's tragedy led to new safety standards that have saved countless lives since then. Mistakes are not the end. They are powerful opportunities to grow and improve. And so, the mystery of the Titanic is not just a story of a ship. It is a story of humanity. It is a reminder of what we can achieve, but also what we must avoid. If this story inspired you today, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Learning English through stories not only improves your language skills, but it also fills your heart with wisdom and motivation. Thank you for watching and for listening. Let's keep learning and growing together.